Chapter 3. Anti-Occultism as a New Form of Nazism.
I don't make the claim lightly that the enemy is reviving Nazism in a new form, nor do I casually compare the methods of the Nazis and anti-cultists. The fact is that for your enemy, Nazism is a very close concept. The Third Reich is where modern anti-cult fighters find their roots. To understand the entire chain of events, it is essential to know that Hitler in particular, and Nazism in general, heavily relied on the Protestant Church and the anti-cult movements of that time.
Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, was known for his radical views. He actively fought against other Christian denominations and religious movements, demanding the death penalty for citizens who understood faith in Christ differently than he did. Moreover, Martin Luther was a fervent anti-Semite. He declared that Jews were a misfortune for the German people, advocated burning their synagogues and schools in the name of the Lord and Christianity, and stated that if he were to baptize a Jew, he would lead him to a bridge, tie a stone around his neck, and push him into the water. These radical views of Martin Luther, which became the foundation of Protestantism, later played a role in the growth and spread of Nazism. Hitler admired Luther and called him the greatest German genius, and Protestant ministers, in turn, began to support Hitler's ideas. German Protestant pastors infected with anti-cultism on the territory of Germany are largely responsible for the spread of Nazism among the German believers. The rise and development of Hitler's ideology was based, among other things, on the Protestant and Catholic religions. Later, atheists were even banned from joining the SS. Thus, a supporter of Hitler was typically a devout Protestant or Catholic. By 1932, Hitler's party, the NSDAP, received 60% of the vote among Protestant pastors. Support ranged from 90 to 100% in small Protestant communities, especially in Bavaria. Historians assert that the Third Reich began in Bavaria as early as 1932. As early as in 1921, in the Protestant Church, the Apologetic Center was established, a prototype of modern anti-cult organizations. Officially, the Apologetic Center was supposed to monitor the activities of other religious movements and inform the Protestant church community about them. In reality, the Apologetic Center began collecting data on various cults, movements, circles, and other associations. In 1932, Pastor Walter Kunneth, an anti-Semite from Bavaria and the chief editor of the Protestant publication Word and Deed, became the head of the Apologetic Center. This marked the beginning of a campaign against non-Christian movements such as anthroposophy, Darwinism, Monism, spiritualism, and occultism. Movements that the Protestant Church viewed as competition. Lectures and articles were produced on this topic, with many ideas and methods inheriting an inquisitorial approach. On April 26, 1933, Walter Kunneth presented a report titled "The Church and the Jewish Question" to the Federal Church Administration in Berlin. In it, he called for the swift eradication of Judaism, which he described as a foreign entity within the body of Germany. This report had a profound influence on the final adoption of anti-Semitic policies. On December 16, 1933, the Gestapo noticed and appreciated the work and methods of the Apologetic Center. Thus, Walter Kunneth united with Adolf Hitler in the mission to eliminate Jewish influence on the life of the people. At the same time, Kunneth sought to permanently rid society of other religious and political minorities. Kunneth was really pleased with the Gestapo's interest in his work. This is what he wrote in his report to the leadership of the Reich's Protestant Church. The Gestapo has expressed great interest in the cult archives of the Apologetic Center, as well as our work in combating free thought, Marxism, and Bolshevism. The Gestapo has expressed a desire to lead the fight against illegal free thought alongside the Apologetic Center in the future. The exchange of materials between the Gestapo and the Apologetic Center has already begun.
From this point on, the staff of the Apologetic Center began intensively supplying the Imperial Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Propaganda, and the Gestapo with materials about the political positions of various religious communities. The Apologetic Center also collaborated with the Reich Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Goebbels, and the Reich Ministry of the Interior. This work focused on developing materials to combat Jews and cults, lists of the so-called cults and sects, that is, any groups the Apologetic Center deemed dangerous to state ideology, were maintained and constantly expanded. As a result, representatives of the Apologetic Center, led by Walter Künnert, produced numerous slanderous pseudo-expert reports. This defamation turned these groups, along with the Jews, into targets for the Nazi dictatorship and subsequent brutal persecutions, including the deportation of their members to concentration camps.
Historian Horst Junginger writes, if in 1931 they counted about 150 religious and non-religious ideological communities for which data were collected, and 2 years later about 250, then by 1936 the archival lists recorded about 500 groups and cults considered dangerous. It is also important to note that violent methods that were later demonstrated by the Gestapo both before and during World War II were borrowed from anti-cult organizations, particularly the Apologetic Center organized by the radical part of the Protestant Church. Prototypes of the anti-cult movement have existed since remote antiquity. Persecution and execution of Jesus Christ, establishment of the Inquisition, all of this, and much more, was practiced by the ancient predecessors of modern anti-cultists. Throughout the centuries, they adapted to external circumstances and changed the form, but always maintaining their essence. Their weapon was, and still is, genocide in its various forms. Thus, the radical views of the Apologetic Center were formed long before the radical views of Adolf Hitler himself. Researchers note that Hitler followed Luther's instructions against the Jews precisely. Historians also emphasize that the pre-existing anti-Semitism on the part of the Church determined the character of the German national movements. In other words, it determined Nazism itself. It means that the radical vector against Jews and dissenters was determined long before the Gestapo emerged. It is interesting that in 1933, immediately after its foundation, the Gestapo began to adopt the experience and exchange documentation, precisely with the anti-cult Apologetic Center. Protestant pastors, who held radical views, constantly urged the Gestapo itself to further tighten its methods of combating Jews and dissent. For example, in 1942, the Bavarian evangelical Lutheran pastor, Friedrich Auer, even demanded from the Nazi government another St. Bartholomew's Night, during which no Jew would be spared. It is also interesting that after the war, these pastors were not prosecuted for their Nazi proclamations. Surprisingly, after the war, Walter Künnert was not convicted for his anti-Semitic views and collaboration with the Gestapo, unlike many other Nazis. On the contrary, Künnert received the Maximilian Order for Science and Art and the Bavarian Order of Merit from the Free State of Bavaria. Starting in 1946, Walter Künnert became a professor of Protestant theology at the University of Erlangen in Bavaria. Künnert was awarded the honorary title of Church Counselor.
Now you know that it was the anti-cultists who were responsible for making Nazism so violent. They made Nazism such as the world knows it nowadays. Moreover, it was with the hands of the anti-cultists of the past that Nazism was revived after World War II. After the victory over Nazism, the international community united to create the United Nations to maintain and strengthen international peace and security, ensuring that humanity would never again experience the horrors of something like Nazism. At that moment, many believed that Nazism was gone forever. However, in 1964, the Protestant Church of Germany officially reinstated the position of Commissioner for Sects and Ideological Questions of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Bavaria, appointing Pastor Friedrich Wilhelm Hack to the role. He became the successor to Kuhnert's Nazi legacy and the leading ideologue of anti-cultism in Europe.
In his studies of sects and cults in Bavaria, Hack referred to the Sektenerhebung, study of sects, conducted by the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Bavaria in 1930. Here's an interesting fact. Hack studied Protestant theology in Bavaria at the University of Nuremberg, during the same years that Kuhnert was a professor of Protestant theology there. At Hack's initiative, the name Working Group on Religious and Ideological Issues from the Nazi regime was revived in the early 1970s. He adopted an almost identical name from the Nazi era, the Department for Religious and Ideological Issues.
All this happened at a time when the world and Germany were trying to live a new, free life, respecting everyone's rights. The flames of Nazism that had engulfed Germany had been extinguished, leaving behind smoldering embers that would have eventually died out on their own, leaving Nazism in the past forever, if not for Hack. He thoroughly rejected the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He rejected what countries, even those that had been enemies, had united for. He rejected the core values accepted by the entire world, values of unity and equality. In his works, Hack declared, if we understand our faith correctly, we have no right to allow the others to continue in their faith. It was on Hack's initiative that lectures and sermons about sectarians and cultists began again in Bavaria, where Nazi ideas had always been powerful. Hack provided instructions that Protestants or Catholics should treat sectarians as subhuman. This reignited the flames of Nazism, and in 1988, 43 years after the fall of the Third Reich, cries were heard once again in Bavaria towards dissenters. Hang them, shoot them all, Heil Hitler. In 1990, the anti-cultist Hack compiled a blacklist of new religious movements, the so-called sects or cults. Only 16 years later did the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany rule that defamation was being used in the fight against these groups. But it was too late, as in those 16 years, the efforts of anti-cultists had already rekindled and spread the flames of Nazism further. Anti-cultists of the past were the forerunners of modern anti-cultists. Anti-cultists never broke the direct line of transmitting their knowledge and methods. Thus, modern anti-cult organizations were established using the model of the Nazi Apologetic Center.
Thus, after World War II, Wilhelm Hack helped his brother in faith, fellow anti-cult activist Johannes Aagaard, establish the Dialogue Center International in Denmark in 1973. Although the center's name suggested peaceful dialogue, it was merely a facade. In reality, Aagaard, like Kuhnert in the Apologetic Center, was a Christian anti-cultist who sought to combat so-called totalitarian sects. Aagaard publicly mocked the First Amendment to the US Constitution, a symbol of a free society, calling it a neurosis and claiming it was unnatural to human nature. The Dialogue Center had branches in Greece, England, India, Ireland, Russia, and Germany, where Hack served as vice president.
And who do you think became one of Aagaard's favorite students? The student whom Aagaard would repeatedly defend in courts. You have already heard a lot about him today, but now you will understand where he got all his methods. The Dialogue Center's representative in Russia was Alexander Dvorkin, Hack's pupil and Aagaard's favorite student. While in exile, Dvorkin closely collaborated with Hack, Aagaard, their follower Pastor Gandau, and other European and American anti-cultists.
Thus, Dworkin directly and wholeheartedly adopted the Nazi methods, modeling his work on centers aimed at combating all dissenting groups of people. Orthodox Christianity in Russia is now repeating the history of Protestantism in Nazi Germany. During the Nazi era, anti-cultism was introduced into Protestantism through the radical views of Martin Luther, and now, in the same way, Russian anti-cultism, led by Razziers, has infiltrated Orthodoxy and is poisoning it from within. History is repeating itself. The Irenaeus of Lyons Center, created by Dworkin in 1993, under the auspices of the Russian Orthodox Church, completely mirrors the Nazi apologetic center established by Kunith. This center claims its mission is religious research. Yet, in reality, it acts as a tool of harmful informational propaganda against new religious movements, ideological associations, and even business structures.
Does your center in the name of Hieromartyr Irenaeus of Lyon currently monitor those networking activities?
Well, of course, we do our best whenever possible. Also, we need to take another stratum into account, that there is a huge number of non-religious cults. I mean all sorts of personal development trainings.
Commercial ones, so to speak.
Commercial ones as well. They are different. Commercial ones include multi-level marketing organizations, for instance, Amway or Herbalife as the most famous one. Although, again, there are very, very many of them. In fact, those are psycho-cults, I mean pseudo-psychological cults. In other words, all kinds of trainings of personal growth, of increasing inner awareness, how to discover femininity or masculinity in oneself, how to win the hearts of the opposite sex, and many, many various types.
Dworkin introduces the term totalitarian sect, and like Kunith, conducts lectures and writes articles on the dangers of sects and cults and the rejection of cultists by followers of the dominant religion. Similarly to Kunith and Hawk, Dworkin compiles lists of totalitarian sects that, in his opinion, threaten religion and the state. In his addresses and lectures, Dworkin even uses the same rhetoric as the Nazis of the past. For example, Hawk categorically rejected the Declaration of Human Rights as unnecessary. Dworkin stated that today's weakness in Europe is a direct consequence of replacing its Christian soul with so-called universal values, which, in reality, mean nothing. Do you remember how Kunith said that Judaism represented a foreign cell in Germany's body that needed to be eliminated? Dworkin claims that
cults bring no benefit to society. We don't know cultists who are writers, artists, music composers, philosophers, and so on. They only drain society of its vital resources. Just like a cancerous tumor pulls the vital resources from the body until it eventually destroys it.
Another method that modern anti-cult groups have incorporated from Nazism into contemporary practice is the creation of blacklists of organizations and groups which they have labeled as sects or cults and which, in their opinion, should be eradicated. They regularly update these lists with new religious movements, making them targets for attacks. Naturally, this is presented as a necessary measure to ensure society's safety in the face of potential threats. Yet, let's go back to the Nazi times so as to draw one more parallel.
When the NSDAP seized power in Germany, and anti-cultists joined forces with them to fight against religious movements that supposedly posed a threat to the nation, the situation for religious minorities began to deteriorate significantly. In 1938, the Guidelines to Combating Sects was published, leading to extremely dire consequences for many dissenters. According to the guidelines, the danger of sects and cults manifested in the following: educating followers to have egocentric views and indifference towards all matters concerning the people and the state, refusal to take oaths and give the German salute, rejection of compulsory military service, rejection of taking on positions in state and movement organizations, refusal to participate in workplace assemblies and to work in the armaments industry, rejection of the National Socialist racial theory. Similarly, Dworkin, on the portal he created, the Information and Consultation Center of St. Irenaeus of Lyon, posted a list of organizations he labeled as destructive cults and totalitarian sects. Each criticized organization has a page featuring a list of negative publications about it from various media sources, which were apparently initiated by the center itself. The style of these publications about different organizations is very similar. They are filled with identical emotional and judgmental headlines and descriptions, and extensively use emotionally charged language, in essence, hate speech. This includes deliberate defamation and the portrayal of members of the criticized groups with dehumanizing labels such as zombies, rapists, slaves, beasts, and other dehumanizing epithets. By means of similar rhetoric, in their time, Nazis dehumanized Jews. Now you see the lists compiled by the Nazis on one side, and, for comparison, the list compiled by the leader of the Russian terrorist anti-cult group, Alexander Dvorkin, on the other. As you can clearly see, the anti-cultist list encompasses virtually all religious minorities in the Russian Federation, including even some representatives of Orthodoxy, whose views differ from the main line of the country's official religion. Additionally, the list includes some business enterprises and secular organizations. Similar lists can be found on the websites of other anti-cult organizations. And among those lists, you can also find a large number of secular organizations in addition to religious ones. These include various medical, sports, social, research, and scientific organizations. In total, millions of people have already been labeled by the anti-cultists. This demonstrates the unimaginable scale of the campaign of harassment against innocent people that the anti-cult movement has launched worldwide.
The primary objective of the lists of the so-called sects is to precisely identify to society, law enforcement, and authorities the so-called dangerous antisocial elements that must be fought against, even to the point of complete eradication. We can see the consequences of creating such lists in the rise of Nazism in Germany.
It is known that a directive signed by Reinhard Heydrich, the head of internal security in Nazi Germany, established the procedure for suppressing certain religious societies and sects, as well as arresting and sending all associated individuals to concentration camps. Among other things, it contains the following lines. Immediate measures will be taken against organizations, clubs, unions, and circles, as well as against leaders and individual people. All organizations, clubs, unions, circles, etc., all without exception will be purged. Existing materials, specifically address lists, card indexes, correspondence, equipment, occult items, writing supplies, and any property will be confiscated. They will be dissolved and banned. Simultaneous searches will be conducted in the homes of leading members of circles, as well as those suspected of possessing such materials. Persons dedicated to secret teachings and sciences are subject to arrest in all cases. Their activities will be banned without exception, under threat of the harshest measures from the state police. In each individual case, they must be sent to a concentration camp. This operation must be carried out throughout the entire Reich, if possible, between 7 and 9 a.m.
Just as anti-cultists did in Nazi Germany, Dvorkin and his network of anti-cult groups provide authorities with materials about representatives of the so-called cults and sects. Dvorkin's center issues defamatory expert opinions on the nature of various groups, prompting authorities to investigate and prosecute them. This slander against innocent people in Russia, just as in the Third Reich, already results in brutal persecution and physical reprisals against citizens. The ideas promoted by Dvorkin reflect the same Nazi stance expressed by Hack, Kunert, and Hitler, hatred of dissent, intolerance, rejection of pacifism, and justification of violence. And this is just one example of many anti-cultists, but it is enough to see their direct connection to Nazism. These are direct proofs that Nazism never disappeared. It has merely changed its form and adapted to new external circumstances. Yet, we can observe a direct line of transmission of knowledge, experience, and methods for combating dissenting groups of people with the aim of their complete eradication. Representatives of global anti-cultism use all Nazi methodologies, but for their purposes, they have expanded and refined them. Thus, the flame of Nazism has intensified. Now you see evidence proving that global anti-cultism is a formidable force that has already gained significant power and is striving towards its goal, the complete destruction of democratic values and the establishment of a new Fourth Reich.